Buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias una vez más por
Good morning,
participar.
everyone. Thank you once again for being part of these webinars. Now we're going to talk about DevOps. No, sorry. Deployment on premises, cloud, AWS, Azure, and more. It will work as usual. First, we'll have the speaker introduce themselves. Then we will have a short presentation. And finally, we'll have a Q&A session. For that, I'm going to ask you to open your cameras and microphone when the time comes to ask the questions. Without further ado, Jose, the microphone and the floor are yours. Good morning, good afternoon, actually, to everyone. My name is Jose Lamas, and I am a product manager at GeneXus. Gonza, good afternoon. My name is Gonzalo Galotti. I work in the development team at GeneXus, specifically in web and backend. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I am Sabrina Juarez. I work in the development team at GeneXus as well. And I'd like to briefly introduce the Ask Me Anything session a bit about what we've been working on this year in terms of application deployment, and particularly in terms of the cloud. I'm having some issues with my slides. Yeah, there we go. Now I can. This year in 2021, which is coming to an end, we focused on trying to enhance the development on the cloud and their deployment. As you may know, the cloud is a great ecosystem that offers a number of benefits. First of all, computing on the cloud, having the possibility of deploying any kind of application, whether it's a web app, services, processes, or batch, ensuring great availability and scalability at a very low cost and providing security. Additionally to that, we can also use data storage. As you know, GeneXus supports all relational databases on the cloud. And this year, we began to work, and we're still working on non-SQL database support, such as DynamoDB. Probably this year and the next year, we will be wrapping up that work. And later on, we will work on CosmoDB support as well. In terms of storage, this is a key resource in this kind of distributed applications, having the chance to store static resources such as multimedia in an external mechanism where you're running your application, which has been supported for quite a long time already. You know, you can store it in any kind of cloud storage. But this year in particular, we worked mainly on trying to strengthen security mechanisms in that cloud storage. Also, this year, we're also working to deploy the Angular applications front office, which are static, so that you can deploy them on the storage of Amazon clouds and Azure clouds. In terms of caching, another important resource for distributed applications, well, we can store all the data cache in a way that is not local. That has also been supported for quite a long time. And this year, we've been working on session state handling support, which means persisting the session of distributed applications on cache networks so that you can meet certain criteria without being subject to some of the main issues. In terms of deployment, specifically, as you well know, you can deploy on premises. You can deploy your GeneXus applications in any of the platforms as a services that are best known. You can also have images of Docker containers and upload it if you want to. And this year in particular, we focused on serverless architecture supports. As far as platforms as a services are regarded in the targets that we have, well, Amazon Web Services, Azure, Google Cloud, SAP, and IBM, which are the best known. But it's worth mentioning that our solutions are extensible or applicable to other deployment destinations if necessary. We can also get a Docker image so that you can upload it to a cluster of Docker containers. What is a Docker image? It's an image It's an isolated environment where you contain everything that is necessary for you to run your application, and that exclusively. And what's good about this is that you can translate this image from your development environment to your testing environment and to your pre-production and production environment just by changing some environmental variables. So it makes our prototyping much easier, and it's easier to put it and faster to put it in production. Another advantage is that it's easily scalable. That means that you can get a cluster of Docker containers with an orchestrator that could be OpenShift or Kubernetes to just balance the nodes of your cluster. And in that way, you can work with the demand that your application requires. So from a very early age, from a very early stage at GeneXus with the 17th version and its upgrades, you can get a Docker image in a cluster of Kubernetes and just upload it to any of the platforms as a services that you're working with to get the most out of the infrastructure of Kubernetes. Now, serverless architecture, as I said, we worked a lot on this year. You can deploy Azure functions and Amazon Lambda functions. Just to give you a little bit of context, this model was used to build the vaccination system for the COVID-19 vaccines in Uruguay. And as the main feature, I would say that it can have very high demand peaks. So a lot of users at the same time, and at some other times, the demand is very low. So if you wanted to cover that very high demand, you would have to be working for the worst case scenario, that highest peak. And then when you have a very low demand, the system would be over-dimensioned and you would be just wasting money. So generally, these are good things for unpredictable models in terms of demand. And what's ideal about them is to scale depending on demand. That means that will be adjusted according to the system's demand. And this is what we get from serverless architecture. This chance of having automatic scalability, and also the fact that you don't need to really worry about infrastructure in the background. And yet another very important feature of this is that you pay as you use exclusively. These are also event-oriented models. So you have an event that triggers the function. In the case of Azure, for instance, you can send a message to a service bus or to a queue storage. And these functions will be subscribed to that storage queue, and they can work with that request. And what is this for? Well, you have some systems and some models that could be very congested because of a very high demand peak. And instead of working with the requirements in a synchronous way, a possible solution is to send a message to a message queue for those requirements to be handled in an asynchronous way, and therefore the system can be decongested to some extent and not get saturated and overloaded. These are some of the scenarios in which you could be using this. We support Azure functions of this kind since the third upgrade and 17th version. And we also have timer trigger functions that are like, for example, a cron after also the 17th version. And some other functions include, for example, HTTP, which is when you get an HTTP request, like a GET or a POST, you name it, well, these functions are triggered as a result. These last, the HTTP kind of request that we work with, we've had them for Azure since the sixth break of our 17th version, are good to create a service API. We also have this for Lambda, the same kind of function that allows us to represent, or let's say model a serverless service API, both on Azure and on Lambda. So whichever REST service that you have in the KB and any API objects can be easily modeled in this way. Also, the backend of our mobile applications, for example, the Android applications or iOS applications backend or Angular applications backend, which are purely REST services, can also be modeled as serverless. So a possible scenario would be, for instance, that you get an HTTP function and you send a message to a message queue or to a service bus, and you can process that asynchronously from another function that would be subscribed to that service bus to decongest the system in a scenario similar to the one that I was telling you about with vaccinations. When you deploy a function on Azure or on Amazon, you can deploy in the API gateways of each of them, which is the case, for example, of Amazon. You've got Amazon API gateway, and you've got Azure API management for Microsoft. And so why would you use this API gateway? Because it allows you to handle your APIs in a centralized fashion, thus administrating authentication, request authorization, request transformation, response and reply transformation, and the versions of the API, which is so important. So wrapping up this deployment aspect, let me tell you briefly about how we do it at GeneXus. We have a tool that is called Application Deployment Tool. The tool is incorporated in the GeneXus ID, and the engine, the base of that tool, means that you can automate all the deployment processes, and you don't need to execute to run the deployment from the GeneXus ID, from within the GeneXus ID. I also wanted to mention something that is very important. In our application, in our general application, we have different components that we identified, such as services on the one hand, or the front office or back office on the other. And each of these components will have certain deployment features that will be different from the others. And so you need to, in a way, single out how to run the deployment of each of them. And for this, GeneXus allows us to model it through what we call a deployment unit, which is a GeneXus object, through which you define one or more than one mains. And as from that GeneXus object, GeneXus will calculate all the dependencies of that object to get the package that corresponds to that scenario, and whether or not you want to deploy it on premises or might as well be on the cloud. So once you have defined your deployment unit, what you select is, well, some of the targets that I was telling you about. I mentioned Docker and serverless, and some of the targets should be selected. So where you're going to deploy each of these deployment units, and GeneXus will set up the package and deploy it accordingly. So this is just as an example, the deployment on Azure Functions. And on the right, you can see very briefly the script of that MS Bill path that corresponds to that deployment. So what I wanted to convey here is that you can automate the deployment process. You may as well get a continuous integration and continuous delivery pipeline and add that continuous delivery pipeline some MS Build scripts so that you can automate the process and get the most out of the fact that you're automatically running these processes and not manually. There is a deep dive that Alejandra Caggiano gave about continuous integration and delivery. If you want to delve into this, I would encourage you to take a look at that video. And what's left for me to say is that we've been working on enhancing the use of cloud applications, as I was telling you before, trying to help you incorporate new technologies in a seamless way and help these processes to be done in an automatic and agile way. And well, thank you, Aníbal. I don't know if you would like to move on to the Q&A session, or if you would like me to say anything else. Very good. Yeah, that was a great presentation. And now we have some questions coming up. I don't know if our attendees in this session have any questions that they would like to ask.
Por ahí tenían alguna pregunta preparada, ¿no?
Okay. I think that we had some question that we had prepared. Well, there is Alvaro Gomez saying that he has a question that he'd like to ask. Um, Great, Alvaro, please feel free to open your microphone and shoot. Well, thank you very much for your opportunity. I wanted to make a comment about this. I've been following this GeneXus cloud topic for a couple of months because uh, it happens that we migrated to the cloud overnight where I work, and we had to deal with some Azure projects also overnight. So at the beginning, I sort of explored the possibility of working with GeneXus. I did some concept trials, concept tests. I uploaded a couple of things. I came across a couple of issues that I was unable to overcome. And we ended up working with a hybrid environment with some things that were made by GeneXus and some things that were like handmade, let's say. But I would like to explore the possibility of, with all these things that you've just told us, I'd like to, entertain the possibility of migrating to GeneXus. But I have a couple of questions, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one that has been through this in the last couple of months. First of all, the desynchrony that you have with local support teams, because every time that we ran into a problem of this kind, we had to wait for a month, sometimes 2 months even, and we didn't have any kind of answer or reply because people, local support does not really have about knowledge about this. And so there was this issue that we needed to overcome, and we just couldn't. And also, documentation is still very generic. It's extremely generic. So it gives you like an overview and some guidelines of what you have to do. But at times, particularly in terms of Azure functions, just a web page to guide you through it will not be enough. And I think that this is a huge issue because I'm certain that most of the GeneXus community has is not really close to this kind of technology yet. So they will you will face this wall at a certain point, and it's really hard to get to the other side if you don't figure these two issues out. So have you done any planning, or have you got any strategic sort of plan to try to overcome these difficulties? Yeah, well, in terms of support and documentation, that is a very important part of our problem. As we work with new technologies and incorporate new products, it's only natural that it will happen that the product will go faster than support training and documentation will. We are well aware of this issue, and we are trying to improve that as fast as we can and get better timing. But there will always be a certain delay or some, lag, falling behind in terms of documentation support. But yes, I see eye to eye with you in that we need to, work much harder so that this delay is not so big.
Tenemos una pregunta de Daniel Ávila.
Daniel Avila has a question. Daniel says, in terms of the app in sync of Google, what version does GeneXus support? Because I was trying to deploy on a Java web, and I haven't been able to work with the SDK version. Thank you very much. Sabrina, is there anything that you'd like to say about that? No, but we can try that. You said Daniel Avila. Okay, Daniel Avila, we have your contact details, and we will get back to you concerning this, if that's okay. Hey, I'd like to ask a question. I don't know if it's my turn, but my name is Alejandro. We're beginning to work with GeneXus. That was not long ago. We began with the first development. And we're working on very simple applications that don't require backend or a database. They do little things such as, well, we try to give like little services to our company users, and we've come across this issue. Whenever we want to deploy something, we always need to generate some services on the cloud, or we need to work with an Azure server or an Azure or an information server, and we're a lab, and security is airtight, and so we basically have a lot of issues as a result. So I have two questions because of this. First of all, if it's a mobile standalone application that does not really require any backend, has no tables, has no databases, is it still necessary to deploy on the cloud? We're trying to, or maybe you could do it like in a serverless way, or perhaps you could work with an internal server, because it's just for like people at our lab to use it, not external clients. Regarding your question, what I haven't really understood is whether you're talking about an SD offline application, or no, it's a mobile application, but it doesn't have any links for people to access it from the phone or request a directory. Let's say that it doesn't have a database or a backend. Well, in that case, GeneXus supports offline mobile applications that allows you, if you want, to have a database inside the application, and you should never need to work with a backend. That is the offline functionality of our applications that has been so for the last couple of versions of GeneXus, and would allow you to overcome these issues. So you wouldn't be needing to work with the backend and a server for your application in particular. But if you wanted or needed at any time to connect with any server, for example, to synchronize a database or call any other service that you need, then that is not exclusive of the cloud. You can just work with your deployment server in a local server, and that shouldn't be complicated. Yeah, but you still need to pay for a license. You need to work. You still need a license, right? You cannot just deploy the application exclusively on the phone, right? If it's offline, yes. What if it isn't? If it's not offline, then you will need a server. That could be a Java server or a Tomcat server. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The problem here is security, because if it's open and internal, that's an entry point to the company's network, the internet. So that is super tough to overcome. Yeah, we can send you some further information on how to create offline applications with GeneXus, and we are at your disposal. Thanks a lot. That would be great. Yeah. Great. I have a question by Henry Russell that tells us, how does the deployment tool handle updates to an active Azure AWS applications?
Yo no entendí ¿Puedes repetirlo,
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question, Aníbal? Yeah, how does the deployment tool handle updates on active Azure AWS applications?
Supongo que es en el caso de AWS.
I'm guessing it's in terms of AWS working with PaaS, with platforms as a service, like how you update the applications in case that you have an Azure application. Is that it? In AWS, well, our MS Build use the deploy tools by Amazon, and in the case of Azure, well, you use the corresponding tool. In any case, our tools, what they do, well, imagine that you have different layers. So what GeneXus ID does is it calls MS Build scripts, And these scripts use tasks that are implemented by us whenever it's necessary to get some information from a database, for example, or get some information on the subjects that you're using to deploy, which are the binaries that you need to deploy. So for that, you use MS Build tasks that are implemented by ourselves. And in terms of packaging, getting a WAR or an OPC or with deploy even, what you use are the standard tools of each of the platforms that you're working with. So in this case in particular, to get the updates of applications that are deployed on Azure platforms or AWS platforms, you use the same tools that each of these platforms provide you with, as I said, through these scripts that I mentioned. I don't know, maybe if he meant the updates. Okay, so Russell Henry is saying something else. He says, I have an Azure application that is constantly being updated. Does the deployment tool handle updates in addition to the initial deployment?
Sí, sí, sirve tanto para la
Yes,
publicación inicial.
it's good both for the initial publication as well as for the updates. As a matter of fact, on the platform, what you define is, well, you create the applications that is just designating a name and the application ID or the credentials. And then always the operations are always updating or defining the content of the application. So whenever you run some of these platform applications to update some of these tools to update the application, that's what it is. It's an update, but you're using exactly the same mechanisms for the first version as well as for all the other versions, all the upcoming versions. From the deployment point of view, what you do is you always send the full content to the application. So what could happen is that the client tools, or in some platforms, you will have some intelligence that is embedded in trying to resolve that whatever is sent is a delta compared to the previous version. But from a conceptual standpoint, what you send, what is operated with is, this is the full content of my application, and this is what I'm going to transfer, at least from a conceptual standpoint. Maybe you have some transference optimization at a binary level, but conceptually speaking, what you do is that you have full content, and every single time that you set it up, you package it and you define what is the full content, and that is what is updated. I don't know if Russell, this has made it clearer. I have Dennis do Nascimento that says, the web field of my client
¿Para qué servlet debo generar WAR?
Sorry, he says, Daniel do Nascimento, I understand, it says the web sphere of my client is the 8.5520 version with Java. What servlet should I create, or what WAR should I create? According to the documentation, I understand that I should be creating it for servlet 3.0. However, the documentation does not have an option also to create it directly on WebSphere. So what should I use? Well, you know, Dennis, I'm jotting down your name, and I will take a look at this because I can't really remember exactly why this is. We talked about this a couple of days ago, as a matter of fact. So I will get back to you. Sometimes what it does happen is that you have some options. For example, in the case of Tomcat, you have Tomcat on the one side, and then serverless on the other, and Tomcat for rules, for example, for URL rights. But I can't remember what WebSphere does exactly. So I promise I will send you a message soon with the answer to your question. Jorge González says, I would like to know where to ask about each of the environment variables or the KB properties, because, for example, the user log level property in the files appears as log level user. So where can you see each variable and the corresponding text?
Yo creo que entendí,
Vale.
sí.
I think I understood what you meant.
Sí, estaba pensando si
I was thinking whether or not I have an answer to that.
para nosotros es fácil porque tenemos
For
acceso
us, it's easier because we have access to the internal names, but I'm wondering whether that is documented elsewhere or
si está o no documentado. Tomamos nota
or
chequear
documented at all. So
cómo hacer para
I
documentar.
will check as soon as possible. And if it is not documented, I should do it as soon as possible. Generally, I think that you were talking about the leg level user function. I think that we have some mechanisms to accept it both with space or without spaces. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that the name that you have, so what would be the display for us and the description of that property is, well, I'm not entirely sure. I think that if you write exactly the text as it appears with spaces and everything, then it should be valid, should be okay. But I can't, be 100% sure. So I promise that I will check that as soon as possible. And I'll get back to you shortly. Thank you very much. That's great. Then we have Marcelo Mosha. I don't know if this is a comment or a question. It says, on GX17 upgrade 6, do you have the chance to deploy a Docker image on an Azure AKS?
Supongo que es una pregunta.
Yeah, I'm guessing it's a question.
Sabrina, estaba entre las competencias.
Sabrina?
Sí, sí, no es que explícitamente esté la opción para hacer
But
deploy.
it's not that you have the explicit function. What we do is in the very same Docker image, we have a build of that image. We create the Docker file. We basically use these requirements to get the Kubernetes later on if you want. So at least you can create the Docker image, and if you want, you can deploy it on Kubernetes. But what we set up is the package files, then you upload the Docker image on Azure's registry, and then from there you get the Kubernetes cluster.
No sé si respondí la pregunta.
I don't know if I answered your question.
Bien. Tenemos otra de Miguel Solano. Dice,
Good. We have another one from Miguel that says how to do a multiple deploy in a scenario in which you have the same application published many times with independent databases.
En el mecanismo que tenemos del deploy,
And the mechanism that we have on the deploy engine,
cuando se hace desde el IDE, por ejemplo,
the deploy that you do from the ID, as Sabrina was showing you, where you have to select your target and input your data and stuff,
ahí se ve como una sola operación.
even though that looks like a single operation, in the background, that is implemented through two calls to MS-Build. One of these calls
Se definen exactamente cuáles son los
defines basically which are the binaries that you need to impact, and the second call packages and deploys.
Esas llamadas se pueden hacer también.
Now, these calls can also be done via command line, which was what Sabrina was saying, and you can get it on a Jenkins pipeline or any other continuous integration engine. And this allows us, well, the second step allows you to package and deploy, as I was saying, or may only do the packaging side of it, but in whichever case, the packages stay. So for example, if you created a WR, which are later deployed on a Java application or a PAS Java environment, then those wars can also be independently deployed on another environment. So you may write scripts and get pipelines that will package first, then will make some eventual adjustments of connection data, for example, or whatever is necessary for different environments, and then you deploy separately in each of them.
No sé si responde eso, Miguel.
I don't know, Miguel, if that answers your question.
ahí tenemos una de Álvaro Gómez.
We have a question by Alvaro Gomez that says, I have an app that uses GAM for authentication, and particularly with Google. When the local prototype is working with the local prototype, it works well, but once on Azure with the URI, the redirectioning URI, it doesn't really work well. So how can I scale this to solve it?
Es una aplicación desplegada en Azure.
It's an application, let me get this straight, that is deployed on Azure using GAM
Contra Google.
and authentication against Google. Okay, and the callback is not working.
Te pide el login.
It will ask you for a login
Vuelve al llamador.
and it doesn't get back to the caller. Is that what you mean?
¿Será que falta la whitelist del sitio?
Perhaps the whitelist of the site is missing on the Google configuration. Could that be the case?
Un dominio de confianza en
Perhaps
Google.
adding the domain as a trusted domain by Google could
¿Cómo es
work.
que podemos ver el caso?
Maybe we can take a look at this particular case.
¿Cómo es el nombre? Aníbal.
Álvaro
No.
Gómez.
What's the name of this person? Alvaro Gomez. Okay.
Denis, por ahí en el chat, si pueden ver, nos detalla un poquito más el problema que está teniendo, ¿no?
Then I don't know if you can see what Dennis is writing on the chat, but he is explaining what's happening. So he says, I generated the WAR for the 3.0 servlet for JRE6 and tested it with a WebSphere, and I'm getting an error. Basically, the server is not found.
Eso si querés, Denis, lo podemos revisar.
Dennis, we can take a look at this. Still, that service, which is giving you the error, this GX resource provider is no longer in use. I don't know which version of GeneXus you're using. Let me see if he set the version above. Because depending on the version, we're not using this service anymore. So as a workaround, perhaps you could remove that while we take a look at this issue. As I said, the new GeneXus versions are no longer using this service.
Así que puede venir por ahí. Si
So
querés,
maybe that could be the thing.
hablamos por este tema.
Okay, so yeah, we'll get back to you and let's talk about this.
Denis dice si lo que tiene que
Dennis is saying, okay, so I'm going to remove the GX resource provider and test again. Is that it?
sí, en el web XML.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
¿Más preguntas?
Any other questions?
Luis Garrone nos comenta, concuerdo que la documentación es muy
Luis
básica y genérica.
Garrone is telling us, I agree that documentation is very basic and generic. You have 2 or 3 cases for typical steps, and it would be great to have that for each article and documentation. That would be extremely helpful. I'm saying this as a suggestion for all the GeneXus documentation or wiki documentation in general.
Ok, recibí el mensaje.
Thank you. Yep, got it. Message acknowledged.
Sí, Aníbal, puedo hacer.
Yes, Aníbal, could I ask you another
Bueno,
question?
en principio, mi nombre es Gabriel Altamirano y trabajo en
Okay, my name
Laboratorio
is Gabriel
Casasco.
Altamirano and I
Recién un
work
compañero mío hizo una consulta.
at a lab. A
Sí,
colleague of mine,
Alejandro.
Alejandro, just asked a question.
Muchas gracias, es un honor acá estar
Thank you very much.
con
It's an honor
ustedes.
to be here with you.
Hemos seguido
in this webinar.
varios videos.
We've watched a
Y
number
bueno,
of your
la
videos,
pregunta,
and
la consulta es, empezamos a
the
desarrollar
question
en
here is, we
GeneXus
began
17
to develop on GeneXus
y
17,
tenemos una conexión a un Edwards
and we have a
que hicimos
connection to an
en
Edwards
un
that
mobile
we
app, ¿no?
did on
En una
a
aplicación
mobile
mobile.
app.
Empecé el desarrollo,
I began
digamos,
the
subiendo
development
al cloud de
process,
GeneXus,
working with the GeneXus
pero ¿qué
cloud.
pasa? Digamos, en mi
But what's
casa
happening
funciona
is that it's working at
porque
home, for
tengo
instance, because I
internet
have
abierta
an open
y en el
internet
laboratorio
connection, and at
deja
the
de
lab
funcionar porque, bueno, está
it doesn't,
apuntando
because
al cloud de GeneXus y eso
it is pointing
no está
you
permitido
towards the GeneXus cloud, and that is
la
not
organización.
allowed
Entonces,
within the organization without my company.
quería ver si me pueden dar una mano
So
con
I just
respecto a
wanted to know if you could help us
si
out
tenemos
in this
una
sense. If we
autenticación, o
have
sea, si se puede meter, si se puede poner
any
GAM,
kind of
y bueno,
authentication, for
evidentemente
instance,
necesitamos un servidor
and of course we need
o
a server,
no, eso es
or
lo
maybe
que
we don't. So that is
no sabemos si,
what we
porque
don't
yo
really know
saco
yet.
de la nube de
Because if
GeneXus la
I
aplicación
take the
y
application out of
tampoco
the
funciona.
GeneXus cloud, well, it's still not working.
Evidentemente algún binario sí
So
sube.
clearly there is some binary that
Lo que hace la
is
aplicación es se comunica con
working, but the
con un servicio
application
REST
is communicating with a REST service,
y devuelve un JSON.
and it gives
Eso es
you a
básicamente lo
JSON
que
back.
hace.
So that is basically what it does.
Y bueno, desde el laboratorio no funciona la
And at the lab,
aplicación.
well, the application is just not
Eso es
working.
ese es el problema que tenemos.
When you're talking about cloud deployment, you mean when you talk about the GeneXus cloud, you're talking about the deploy to cloud function.
Claro, sí. Deploy to
Yeah,
cloud,
yeah,
exacto.
exactly.
Sí,
That
es la
function, deploy to
configuración
cloud. That is the setup that
que pusimos en
that we have.
principio, y ahí funciona.
Then it works.
Pero cuando llevamos al laboratorio,
But the moment that you get to the
digamos,
lab,
nosotros tenemos una internet cerrada,
because we have a
así
closed
que
internet
o tendríamos
connection,
que ver
it
que esos
doesn't.
binarios que suben
So we
al
should
cloud
see whether or not those binaries that
se
are
deployen,
deployed on the
no sé
cloud.
cuál sería la alternativa a
Well, I don't know how
en la
to.
intranet, de
What would
alguna
be the
manera, o
alternative for our
un
intranet?
servidor.
Perhaps a server. Yeah, well, the fact that any kind of outside access is restricted, there isn't much that we can do. You may as well consider it as an exception, which I know has been the case many times, because you have like certain IPs, so you can even work in very restricted environments with some exceptions. So you enable some ports in some IPs, and then it should be up and running, even though you're working with the lab's intranet. Or the other option is perhaps the only one option is to deploy something that is inside the intranet. So instead of working with a direct deployment on a GeneXus bill, which I think is what
Claro,
you're
sí,
doing, according to what you said.
eso en principio, perdón que te interrumpa,
Yeah, sorry to
pero
interrupt you.
eso es en principio para hacer pruebas nada más.
That is at the
Pero
beginning,
bueno,
just
la
for the
evolución
sake of
nuestra,
testing, but our evolution,
no sabemos a dónde nos va a llevar.
well, we don't know where we're going. Yeah, the next step then would be to use these deploy engine options, so you can define a deployment unit for the backend services of your mobile applications. All the web components, you may define that as well. But if it is just a mobile application, you should create a deployment unit object, then associate it to a main panel of the mobile application. Then you do the packaging of all the services. And if you're working with Java, you can get a WAR, and you can use that WAR for the deployment.
Claro, o
So
sea,
it's exactly what we've
sí,
been talking
nosotros
about,
tenemos
right?
la
Yeah.
licencia para
Okay,
.NET, eso
we have
sería
the
para Internet
.NET
Information
license,
Services.
and that would be
No
for
nos serviría el
that
Tomcat.
wouldn't be good then for Tomcat, for example.
Ah, ok.
Would it? Yeah, absolutely.
Está
That's
bien.
exactly what you should be doing. If you define it as an environment with .NET, it is going to be generated in .NET. It's going to be packaged there, and you can just use the deploy engine to link it directly to some IS that you have, and then the running of that is directly on the IS, or you can just tell it to use the package unit to generate it, and you can do the updates outside, or you can just send it to someone for it to be checked. Yeah, but yeah, that would be the mechanism. Whether it's because you want to have it in a computer that is part of the intranet, so you won't have that firewall issue, or perhaps in a machine that is just an exception for it to have access from within the lab.
Perfecto. Bueno, muy claro. Bueno, ahora me
Perfect.
faltan los conocimientos.
That was very clear, thank you.
Sí, eso es lo que tendríamos,
Yeah,
por donde
exactly.
tendríamos que
That's exactly
orientarnos.
what we should be doing. Great.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much. Please, my pleasure. You can also prototype locally, right, Jose? Because I think that they're using these deploy to cloud function to prototype, and you can do that locally. And on .NET, you don't need to have anything installed, nothing at all. Yeah, absolutely. So if it's just for prototyping, then you can prototype directly on the local computers. But I understood that on top of the prototype, then you should also
Claro, claro,
make it
sí, sí,
something that they can
porque,
use later
a
on.
ver, se
Yeah,
comunica con
yeah,
un
indeed, because
servidor REST. Eso no
that is
sé
working
si,
with a REST, that is communicating with a
si es
REST
necesario
server,
que, digamos, esa lógica suba
and I don't know if
a la nube de alguna manera o simplemente
this
con con la
can be done
comunicación
on the
para
cloud, or perhaps
manipular un
just with the
JSON.
communication to manipulate, to
No
handle
necesito
a
nada de la
JSON. You
nube.
don't need anything from the cloud. Then, well, it does not necessarily need to be the cloud. It needs to be an IP that can be accessed from the mobile application.
Ah, está
And at
bien.
the same time, if the mobile application is accessed through a Wi-Fi
Sí.
network from the lab, for instance,
Sí, o sea,
then that it works as
como
well.
es digamos, la lógica que es en .NET,
Yeah.
sí o sí tiene que estar en algún servidor.
Yeah, the logics
como
which are
para que se
on
acceda.
.NET need to be on a server, but yeah. Now, thinking out loud, another thing that you could try would be, even with this deploy to cloud mechanisms, should already be restricting any kind of like
Disculpa,
uploading,
no te
right?
escuché.
Sorry, can you say that again? With this build mechanism,
Sí.
with deploy to cloud, does it work from within the
No,
lab to
me
create a build
funciona
and then
desde mi
to
casa.
upload
O
it?
sea,
No,
desde mi
no, it
casa,
doesn't. It
porque yo
works
tengo el
from
acceso,
home
digamos, a
exclusively
los
because they
servidores
have
de GeneXus
access to the GeneXus servers
laboratorio, pero no, digamos, no desde la
from the lab,
intranet. Yo
but
estoy en la
not from
intranet
the
y ahí ya
intranet.
deja de funcionar todo.
The moment that I'm connected to the intranet, it stops working. Well, okay, because if you could do this build for this mobile application, unless you have it through a lab Wi-Fi that goes through a firewall, if you connect it directly to whatever internet provider that you have, then you might as well, have it directly on
Claro.
the GeneXus
Sí,
cloud.
sí,
But
sí,
yeah,
o
I
algún
understand what happens in
otro
your case.
servidor
Yeah, or any
de
other
cloud,
server,
¿no? Sí.
for that matter, right?
No,
Any
pero
other
sí,
cloud
no
server.
es el
Yeah, but
caso, ya
that's not
no
the case.
tenemos, o sea, no tenemos la parte de internet.
We don't have internet at all. Sorry, I work with Gabriel, and I'd like to say something. Could you tell us at some point what URLs you have, or what IP ranges you need to ask the intranet to enable, so that we don't have this compilation error? Because we've been trying and we haven't really had any answer from support. Well, when you deploy, depending on the generator and depending on some properties, that goes to a server that is like
Sí,
app
app 5
6
es.
or app 5. Yeah, okay, app 5. Okay, that usually resolves an IP that is basically static. So if you check through DNS what IP that is, then you should find it easily. Okay, because some days for example, on Monday it compiled, but it didn't on Tuesday. And it says because it's a dynamic IP, so you need to get an IP range, but I don't
Claro,
think that's the
ahí
case.
tenemos otro problema que es
that's another
el
issue.
Gradle cómo es del mobile,
You have this
de Android,
Android,
exacto. El Gradle de Android nos está dando excepciones
that is giving
y
us
no podemos
exceptions.
llegar no sé si baja unos XML.
I don't know if it's,
Y eso es lo que nos está dando problemas en el arranque ya, porque en la compilación
XMLs,
ya no genera el
causing
objeto.
some trouble from the start, because in the compilation it's not generating the object. Hey, good afternoon. I also work with Alejandro and Gabriel.
Las primeras aplicaciones.
And we are generating the first mobile applications. And as Gabriel was saying, the issue is that when you are compiling within the intranet at the lab, as we don't have full browsing permits or full surfing permits, when you start compiling Android, if you get a full internet permit, when you compile, it downloads some Android dependencies, it finds it, and it compiles well. But the problem is when you don't have access or full internet, then it tries to download these dependencies, and basically it messes up all the compilation in GeneXus. But as Alejandro was saying as well, we've tried it several times. We're working with the things here, the infranet and the intranet stuff are asking us always for the same thing, the URLs and the IP ranges, but that's something that we cannot find on GeneXus. We just get the websites that you're trying to access, but yeah, we've been stuck with this for the last 2-3 weeks. And as Gabi said, we may make any progress from home because we have no restrictions, but it would be optimal to be able to use it from the lab, and, so that we can really set up the firewall with the exceptions. But we don't know how to tell the infra guys which exceptions they should be working with. Okay, let's do this. We will check it out, and we will. I will get back to you. These are some separate cases. In the case of the deploy to cloud server, in our case, that is update 6 or 5. Maybe the IP may be changed occasionally, but we are not using a dynamic IP, but rather an IP that is assigned and that is quite stationary. Maybe for some reason every 3 months it should be changed, but that is not a procedure. So then, of course, if as part of the build you're trying to get an Android package that needs to be connected to another server that is using another IP, then of course you need to see which IP you're accessing and get the exceptions for that. It could be also the case for something else, such as trying to connect to whatever and get the same error. That is something that you need to work with step by step to see what gets stuck and work with the corresponding exceptions. Okay. I don't know exactly which are the URLs or the IPs, but it's a matter of finding the correct information, I think.
Bien, muchas gracias. Gracias por el
Great.
tiempo.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Paulo Sanseviero han puesto
Okay.
alguna información al respecto.
On the chat, there is some information that Jorge and Enrique shared on the chat. Dio Bisaira says, if you have an app to deploy with a change in database structures, do you normally generate to include programs of the organization and run them, deploying on a production database where you don't always have your organization's programs working correctly, given the existing data?
Sí, a ver, ahí depende del escenario de cada uno.
Well, in that case, it depends on each person's scenario. In some cases, you organize against databases in a controlled environment, but from their own network. But now it's also possible to package it in the organization and send it elsewhere for it to be run elsewhere. Definitely, it's one of those things that requires more care when you handle it. For now, you can package the same MS Build task in the organization with the same stuff that is running the ID, and that can be executed against a database that is production or whatever, and it should be working. But it's something that we're still working on for it to make these operations a bit more high level, to orchestrate these things and run these actions separately. Okay. Okay, is anyone going to ask a question? Okay. Okay. Is it possible to modify Is it possible to modify the web.config of an application when you execute deploy tool, or where should I modify this so that I don't have to modify manually every single time that I generate a deploy? In this case, the deploy tool uses a template that is in the GeneXus net. So if you need to add something specifically for your application that is not modeled within GeneXus, you could touch that template that is in the folder that I'm sharing with you on the chat right now. You can edit it. And so when you deploy, you have the application with the web config that you want. This is one of the easiest ways of doing this. The only problem is that every single time that you update GeneXus, you will need to be careful about your changes with the new changes that come with the new GeneXus build. Yeah, maybe it should be about why you want to make that change manually. What is it that you're changing that needs to be manual? If these are connection data, the way of changing connection data when deploying is with a call, right? So it shouldn't be necessary then. Can you hear me? The thing is like this, we want to increase the timeout of a call. A practical example is, for example, through SAP. And when you call a standard API, it takes a very long time to consume all the data that are coming. And so we need to increase the timeout for a web application specifically. Are you talking about the request timeout? Okay. Yes.
Eso lo haces modificando el web config y poniendo que.
You're doing that by modifying the web config and writing what? We add a property and we add the default timeout. Okay, probably the way out would be along the lines of what Gonzalo was saying. For these things, we use templates in which you modify some values. If the modification that you're doing is something fixed, you could modify the template so that you have by default what you want. If it's something that could depend on a number of applications at different times, then you could modify the template, but at the same time, you should add a new parameter to be modified, and then the script does it automatically. Sorry, just a comment. Maybe in your case, it would be better to change the way, instead of getting the user stuck for a couple of minutes, 5 minutes, whatever, to get that submitted task and then from WebSocket, let the user know about the results. Maybe that would be better from a UX experience. And at the end of the day, you don't really need to change much. Okay, great tip. Great tip. Thank you, Gonzalo. Hello. Okay, we have one more question. I just wanted to add something to what was said. We had a similar case in which we also touched the template, but it didn't always work. And in this property in particular, what it does is it increases the Tomcat timeout in our case, the Tomcat sessions. So you have, let's say that by default, you have 30 minutes in the session with Tomcat, and sometimes we make it expire a bit faster. And that depends on which application you are deploying. Most cases, by default, it's good. But I think that it's the same problem as was mentioned before. It's how to configure that. And what I do nowadays is to get the web XML through Jenkins. So I do the integration in that way. And maybe that property is something that could be, why not, customizable with environment properties together with, in the same way as you have, for example, CORS, when you have a request, and error handlers also, which of course it's something that we're working with. Thanks. Okay, so we're coming to the end. Sorry, can I ask a last question? Okay, last one, and we're closing. Okay, first of all, I'd like to say that I'm from Chile, and maybe the previous person was as well. I think I know them, but yeah, it's true what he was saying. At least here in Chile, we've had some difficulty in facing this cloud world because the management say, let's migrate to the cloud, and here we go, and what we have should be enough. And the problem with GeneXus in that case is, well, in the case of GeneXus 17.NET Core, whenever you talk about the cloud, you talk about a provider, in this case Azure, and they say, okay, but what about security? So I just wanted to wrap up with this. Here we are using the last technology, but also in terms of documentation, I believe that this is something that you've been through, that it's still not enough. And also, whenever we try to reach you directly, we are told that we have to go through a process that takes a couple of months, and that is, and then all the questions that we had, well, it's just we got bored and we went in another direction. So I just wanted to say that in Chile we are working with this. I try to work with Amazon Kubernetes services. I try to work with this Azure provider. I understand that there are some others, and that GeneXus doesn't work with all the images and Docker and stuff, but there is a handmade world of this integration process that has been very, very hard. And maybe creating a link every now and then with some of the experts, perhaps, Sabrina, so that we could have some direct communication could be really helpful. And in the case of .NET Core, for example, we've worked with Claudia Muriallo, but I think that had it not been because of that, we would have never got to where we are. So that's what's really important to us. Any comments on that? Okay, great. So let's call it a session. Remember that this webinar will be is recorded, and you will find it at www.genexus.live, as well as all the webinars that you would like to register for. Thank you very much for attending this event, and see you next time. Thank you.